the mansion's shadow. At asterisk 2:44 a.m. asterisk, the iron gates of the Kang estate groaned open, slicing through the heavy silence of the Seoul outskirts. The gravel driveway crunched beneath the tires of a single black sedan, its headlights cutting through the thick midnight mist like two predatory eyes. Inside the mansion, every light was extinguished except for those in the grand foyer. There stood Kang Yi-hyun asterisk, a 34-year-old Mafia sovereign whose sharp jawline and tailored black suit commanded a terrifying, silent authority. His eyes, dark and unreadable, remained fixed on the entrance as the heavy oak doors swung inward. Between two massive guards stood Min Seo-yeon asterisk. She was small, her messy hair damp from the rain, and her simple, oversized clothes hung off her thin frame. To anyone else, she looked like refuse, a girl the world had chewed up and spat out at the docks. The mansion's head maid, Han Jae-yoon asterisk, stepped forward to receive the cargo, but froze. She looked at the girl's wide, expressive eyes that didn't hold the desperation of a victim, but the cold, observant stillness of a hunter. Jae-yoon's hands trembled. She had served the most dangerous men in Korea, but something about this girl's silence felt more dangerous than a loaded gun. Yi-hyun took a single step toward them, the click of his shoes echoing like a countdown. He didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the maid. His gaze was locked on Seo-yeon, searching for the crack in her resolve that never came. Jae-yoon, Yi-hyun's voice was a low, dangerous velvet. "Why, yes, boss," the maid stammered. Yi-hyun leaned down, his shadow completely swallowing the girl, yet he didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. Instead, he spoke a single command that would rewrite the laws of his empire. "Clean her up, feed her, and remember one rule." He paused, his piercing eyes scanning the room to ensure every guard felt the weight of his words. "Don't touch what isn't yours, because from this moment she belongs to the house." The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when the first gift from Park Do-won arrived at the estate. It wasn't delivered by a professional courier, but by a man in a grease-stained uniform, his hands shaking so violently that the cardboard box he held rattled with a rhythmic, metallic clicking. From the shadows of the second-floor balcony, Min Seo-yeon watched. She didn't hide behind the balustrade. She simply stood in the darkness, a ghost in oversized silk pajamas provided by the maid. Below her, the courtyard was a hive of controlled aggression. 4 of Yi-hyun's guards had already surrounded the delivery man, their hands hovering over the grips of their holstered pistols. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. To the guards, the threat was the box, a potential explosive, a severed warning, or a biological hazard. But Seo-yeon's wide, expressive eyes weren't on the package. She was watching the man's throat. She noticed the way his carotid artery throbbed against his skin. She saw his gaze flicker, not toward the guards threatening his life, but toward the black SUV idling 100 yards past the gate. He wasn't a martyr. He was a distraction. "Boss," Choi Ming-kai called out as Kang Yi-hyun stepped onto the gravel. Yi-hyun looked immaculate even at dawn, his white shirt crisp, his presence a cold front that chilled the morning air. He looked at the trembling courier with a gaze that could peel paint. "Open it," Yi-hyun commanded, his voice devoid of curiosity. As the guard reached for the lid, a sudden, frantic panic seized the courtyard. The courier began to hyperventilate, stumbling backward. The guards tensed, expecting a blast. But Seo-yeon, perched above like a silent gargoyle, noticed the courier's hand twitching toward a secondary pocket, not for a detonator, but for a burner phone. She saw the reflection of a sniper's scope glinting from the tree line, a mile away, timed perfectly for the moment the guard's attention was buried in that box. "Down," she whispered. The word was barely a breath, but in the sudden vacuum of silence as the box lid creaked open, it reached Yi-hyun's ears. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look up to see who spoke. He reacted to the instinct he recognized in her voice, a shared frequency of survival. Yi-hyun lunged, grabbing the courier by the throat and dragging him behind the engine block of the nearest sedan, just as a high-caliber round shattered the marble fountain, where he had been standing a second before. The box fell, spilling out nothing but dozens of live, venomous vipers, a literal and symbolic nest of snakes meant to scatter the guards. In the ensuing chaos of gunfire and sliding scales, Yi Hyun looked up. Seo Yeon was still there, leaning over the railing, her expression terrifyingly calm. She wasn't afraid of the bullets or the snakes. She was simply memorizing the muzzle flashes in the woods. For the first time in 11 years, Yi Hyun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He realized then that the girl no one wanted wasn't just a guest. She was a mirror, reflecting a world of violence he thought he alone understood. The armory was located 3 levels beneath the mansion's foundations, a subterranean sanctuary of cold steel and oil-scented air. It was a place where Yi Hyun usually came to find the clarity of silence, but tonight, the silence was already occupied. He found her standing before a display of combat blades, her small silhouette framed by the harsh glow of the lead strips. She didn't jump when the heavy, pressurized door hissed shut behind him. In her right hand, she held a double-edged karambit, its curved claw reflecting the predatory glint in her eyes. Yi Hyun approached with the measured stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't call out to her. He simply watched as she traced the serrated edge with a thumb that didn't tremble. To any other observer, it was a terrifying sight, a child playing with a death sentence. But Yi Hyun saw the way her grip was naturally low, her center of gravity shifted to strike from the shadows. "You're holding it like a victim," he said, his voice echoing off the reinforced concrete walls. "You're showing the world what you intend to do before you've even decided to do it." He stepped into her personal space, his presence looming like a dark mountain. Seo Yeon looked up, her expressive eyes searching his face for a reprimand, for the inevitable moment he would disarm her and send her back to the safety of the upper floors. Instead, Yi Hyun reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers on the hilt. He didn't pull the weapon away. He adjusted her wrist, tilting the blade inward against her forearm, vanishing the steel behind the line of her sleeve. "The world expects you to be a girl who needs a shield," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her hair. "But a shield only delays the end. If you want to survive what is coming, you don't hold the weapon. You become the weapon." He guided her hand in a fluid, blurring motion, a strike that came from nowhere and returned to nothing. It was a lesson in lethality, stripped of all ceremony. For a moment, the gap between the ruthless Mafia boss and the discarded girl vanished. They were simply 2 creatures forged in the same fire, learning how to burn. "Park Do-won thinks he's hunting a wolf and a lamb," Yi Hyun said, stepping back and letting go. The blade was gone, hidden perfectly against her skin, invisible to the naked eye. "Let him keep thinking that. Invisibility is a deadlier advantage than any bullet." He turned toward the door, his black suit coat billowing like a shroud. "If you stay in this house, Seo Yeon, you leave your innocence at the gate. From tonight on, you are the blade I keep in the dark." As the door sealed shut, Seo Yeon didn't move. She simply looked at her empty hand, feeling the weight of the steel hidden against her wrist, and for the first time she didn't look like a girl who was waiting for the end. She looked like the girl who would start it. The midnight air in the estate's traditional stone garden was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. High above, the security monitors in the command center showed nothing but empty gravel paths and swaying bamboo, but Min Seo-yeon knew the cameras were lying. She had seen the subtle stutter in the frame rate, a digital loop planted by a professional. She sat on a low stone bench near the koi pond, her small frame partially obscured by the shifting shadows of a willow tree. In her lap, she held a book she wasn't reading. Instead, her ears were tuned to the rhythm of the night. There. The sound of a footfall on moss, a sound too heavy for a garden cat. Then, the faint metallic click of a suppressor being threaded onto a barrel. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness of the perimeter wall. They moved with the synchronized grace of Park Do-won's elite hitters, their eyes fixed on the mansion's rear entrance. They didn't notice the girl. To them, she was just a piece of the scenery, a harmless girl discarded by the world. Seo Yeon didn't scream. She didn't run for the guards. Instead, she stood up slowly and began to walk toward the ancient stone well at the far end of the garden. She moved with a slight, practiced stumble, projecting a vulnerability that acted like a magnet. Behind her, the lead assassin signaled his team. A witness was a liability, but a captive was leverage. They changed course, pivoting away from the house and following her deeper into the labyrinth of hedges. She led them past the primary security sensors, navigating a path through the blind spots she had memorized while watching Yi Haiyun's men patrol. She was pulling them toward the North Pavilion, a section of the garden currently under renovation, where the ground was a patchwork of open trenches and heavy machinery. Just as the lead assassin reached out to grab her shoulder, Si-Hoyeon vanished. She didn't run, she simply dropped. She slipped into a narrow drainage pipe she had scouted days prior, disappearing into the earth. The assassins halted, confused by the sudden evaporation of their prey. In their hesitation, they stepped onto the heavy steel plating covering a construction pit. Above them, a single red light flickered on a crane. Si-Hoyeon had pulled the manual release lever hidden behind the pavilion's pillar. A massive crate of decorative stone, weighing 3 tons, plummeted from the hoist. The impact didn't just neutralize the threat, it triggered the estate's secondary, dead man seismic alarms. A second later, the garden was flooded with blinding white spotlights. Yi Haiyun appeared on the terrace, his gun drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. He expected to see a breach. Instead, he saw 3 of Do-won's best men trapped in a kill zone of fallen stone and twisted metal. Si-Hoyeon stepped out from behind the pillar. The hidden blade Yi Haiyun had given her still tucked invisibly against her wrist. She looked at him, her face as calm as the surface of the pond. And for the first time, Yi Haiyun realized his estate wasn't a fortress because of its walls. It was a fortress because of the girl he had brought inside them. The high-rise boardroom overlooking the neon veins of Seoul felt less like a meeting space and more like a glass-walled cage. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows in rhythmic sheets. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken threat of betrayal. Kang Yi Haiyun sat at the head of the mahogany table, his expression a mask of granite, while his right-hand man, Choi Ming-kai, stood like a sentinel by the heavy reinforced doors. They were here to negotiate a ceasefire, but the silence from the opposing side was too long, too expectant. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with a sudden, sickening darkness. The city lights below flickered and died as the building's power grid was severed. In the heartbeat of vacuum-sealed silence that followed, the glass windows didn't just break, they disintegrated. Flashbangs detonated in a blinding sequence of white light and ear-shattering thunder. Do-won's men didn't come through the doors. They descended from the roof on repelling lines, black-clad silhouettes bursting through the crystalline shards. "Boss, get back!" Ming-kai roared, his weapon already barking into the smoke. He lunged toward the breaker panel to trigger the emergency shutters, but a secondary explosion ripped through the hallway behind him. A heavy fire door slammed shut, buckled by the blast, physically severing the room in 2. Ming-kai was on the other side, his voice muffled by the shriek of twisted metal and the relentless chatter of submachine guns. Yi Haiyun was alone. He flipped the heavy mahogany table with a surge of adrenaline, using the thick wood as a temporary shield against the hail of lead. The air was a whirlwind of splinters and plaster dust. Every exit was a kill zone. Through the haze, he saw the thermal lasers of at least a dozen rifles painting red dots across his chest. He fired back, his movements precise and lethal, but for every man he dropped, 2 more emerged from the shadows. His ammunition was a dwindling currency. For the first time in a decade, the cold calculation in Yi Haiyun's mind yielded to a primal realization. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered in a sky-high tomb. As a tactical light blinded him from the left, Yi Haiyun felt the sharp sting of a graze against his shoulder. He retreated into the narrow service corridor behind the bar, his breath hitching as he slammed a fresh magazine into his pistol. He was the king of the Seoul underworld, but as the heavy boots of Do-won's assassins closed in, the walls felt like they were breathing, tightening around him. He looked at the security camera in the corner, its red power light dead, and wondered if the girl in the mansion was watching a black screen, or if she already knew that the protection he had promised her was about to expire. The metallic tang of blood filled Yi Hyun's mouth, a sharp contrast to the expensive scotch that had lined the bar moments before. He slumped against the shattered marble of the service counter, his breath coming in jagged, shallow hitches. A bullet had torn through his side, and another had lodged in his thigh, pinning the invincible boss to the wreckage of his own ambition. The gunfire had ceased, replaced by the rhythmic, terrifyingly slow crunch of boots over broken glass. Park Do-won stepped into the light, his silhouette framed by the jagged remains of the window. He looked down at Yi Hyun with a grin that was more of a scar than an expression. Behind him, 5 men stood with rifles leveled at Yi Hyun's head, their laser sights dancing like red insects over his blood-stained white shirt. "Look at you, Yi Hyun," Do-won chuckled, the sound grating like sandpaper. He reached down, grabbing Yi Hyun by his silk tie and jerking his head back against the stone. "The great wolf of Seoul, dying in a pantry because he got soft. We all heard the rumors. We thought they were jokes." Yi Hyun didn't flinch, even as the barrel of Do-won's gold-plated pistol pressed into the hollow of his throat. He looked at his rival with eyes that were still dangerously calm, though his skin was turning the color of ash. "You traded your edge for a stray," Do-won spat, leaning in close enough that Yi Hyun could smell the peppermint on his breath. "You wasted your heart on a girl the world didn't even want to keep as a slave. Did you think playing house would protect you? Or did you think a broken little thing like her could actually love a monster like you?" Do-won straightened up, laughing as he signaled his men to tighten the circle. "That's the problem with monsters, Yi Hyun. They always think they can find a home, but all you've done is give me a second target. Once I finish you, I'm going back to that mansion. I'm going to show that girl exactly what happens to the protections of a dead man." Yi Hyun's hand tightened around the hidden blade Seo-yeon had returned to the armory, but his strength was fading. The edges of his vision were beginning to fray into blackness. He was a giant who had finally hit the ground, and as Do-won pulled the hammer back on his pistol, the only thought in Yi Hyun's mind wasn't of his empire or his life. It was a silent, desperate hope that the girl had learned the lesson he taught her in the dark. "She wasn't a waste of heart, Do-won," Yi Hyun whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power. "No," Do-won sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "She's just a waste of time. Goodbye, Yi Hyun." Finger on the trigger never completed its pull. A sudden, absolute darkness swallowed the room, a blackness so thick it felt physical. The hum of the building's backup generators, which should have kicked in within seconds, remained dead. In the void, the confident breathing of Do-won's assassins shifted into the frantic shuffling of men who had lost their greatest advantage, their sight. "The backup, why isn't the power coming back on?" Do-won screamed, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp edge of panic. Then a sound emerged from the corner of the room, a rhythmic, metallic tapping. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a blade tapping against a glass shard. "Who's there?" Do-won roared, swinging his gold pistol wildly into the dark. "Kill anything that moves." A flare of green light ignited near the floor. It wasn't a spotlight, but the soft, ghostly glow of a tactical tablet. In its luminescence stood Min Seo-yeon. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't the unwanted girl from the shipping container. She was wearing a tactical headset, her small fingers dancing across a digital interface with the speed of a virtuoso. "Your technicians used a standard 256-bit encryption for the building's substation," a voice said. It was low, melodic, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Yi Hyun's eyes snapped open. He had never heard her speak before, but he knew that voice. It was the voice of the predator he had sensed the night they met. You can talk," Do-won gasped, his eyes widening as the tablet's light revealed the girl's calm face. Seo-yeon didn't look up from the screen. "I spent my life being moved like cargo, Do-won. When you are treated like an object, you learn how the machinery of the world works. I didn't just cut your power. I rewrote the logic gates on your escape vehicle's ignition systems. Your men outside are currently locked in cars that won't start, listening to a frequency that is jamming your comms." She looked up then, the green light reflecting in her expressive eyes, making her look like a vengeful spirit. The fragile girl stepped over a pile of glass, her movements fluid and silent, moving toward the injured Yi Hyun like a shadow reclaiming its owner. "He told me to become the weapon," she whispered, her gaze shifting to the terrified Do-won. "But I was already the weapon. I was just waiting for a hand worth holding." She reached the edge of the tablet's light and closed the screen. The darkness returned, but this time, the fear belonged to the men with the guns. "You shouldn't have underestimated the trash," she said into the silence, "because trash is what you're left with when everything else has been burned away." The darkness was not a void. It was Seo-yeon's element. While Do-won's men fumbled for tactical lights that she had already remotely disabled, she moved through the wreckage with the terrifying grace of a phantom. A flashlight flickered to life in the hand of an assassin to the left. The beam sliced through the dust, but before it could settle on Yi Hyun, a shadow blurred across the light. Seo-yeon didn't strike with a roar. She struck with the lethal economy Yi Hyun had taught her in the armory. The double-edged blade he had adjusted against her wrist weeks ago flashed in the dimness. With a precise, blurring motion, she severed the tendons in the gunman's wrist. The weapon clattered to the floor, followed by a choked cry of agony. "Kill her, just kill her," Do-won shrieked, firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room in strobe-like bursts, revealing Seo-yeon not as a girl cowering, but as a predator closing the distance. She didn't use the knife to kill. Not yet. She used it to create chaos. She pivoted behind the second guard, her small frame making her an impossible target in the cramped corridor. With a flick of her hand, she drove the pommel of the blade into a pressure point at the base of his skull, using his collapsing body as a human shield against a spray of bullets from the right. Yi Hyun, watching from the floor, felt a surge of cold fire through his veins. The sight of the fragile girl standing between him and a dozen rifles acted as a visceral adrenaline shot. He saw the opening she was forcing into existence. Every time an assassin tried to aim at him, Seo-yeon was there, a whirlwind of steel and shadow that forced them to adjust, to hesitate, to fail. She was the shield, but she was a shield made of razor wire. In the next flash of gunfire, she executed the exact move from Chapter 3, a fluid, inward strike that bypassed the guard's tactical vest. The distraction was total. Do-won's focus was shattered, his eyes wide with the realization that he was no longer the hunter. "Now, Yi Hyun," she called out, her voice a sharp command that cut through the thunder of the room. Gritting his teeth against the white-hot pain in his side, Yi Hyun lunged from the shadows. He didn't need much, just the 3 seconds of pure, unadulterated panic Seo-yeon had gifted him. He snatched his fallen pistol from the glass-strewn floor. His movements were a jagged echo of hers, a symphony of lead and desperation. The first 2 shots took out the remaining guards. The third sent Do-won's gold-plated pistol spinning into the abyss of the broken window. The room fell into a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of Do-won's heavy, terrified breathing and the soft, rhythmic tap of Seo-yeon's blade returning to its place against her skin. The giant had risen, and the girl was no longer unwanted. She was the reason he was still breathing. The dawn that broke over Seoul was not the pale, hopeful light of a new beginning, but a cold, sharp silver that mirrored the steel of the estate's gates. The high-rise was a tomb of glass and silence, the war ending not with a grand declaration, but with the quiet thud of Park Do-won's knees hitting the floor. He looked up at the 2 figures standing before the jagged remains of the window, the wounded giant and the shadow girl, and realized he had never been fighting a man. He had been fighting a shift in the natural order. Yi Hyun leaned heavily on a pillar, his blood soaking into the expensive carpet, but his eyes were fixed on Seo-yeon. She stood at the edge of the precipice, the wind whipping her damp hair, her face as unreadable as a frozen lake. She didn't look like a girl who had been saved. She looked like a queen who had just surveyed her borders and found them wanting. Choi Ming-kai and the rest of the loyalists finally breached the fire doors, their weapons drawn, expecting to find a massacre. They found one, but it wasn't their boss on the pyre. Ming-kai stopped, his gaze moving from the fallen assassins to the small girl holding the tactical tablet. He lowered his gun, a slow, profound respect dawning on his face. "Boss," Ming-kai whispered, stepping toward Yi Hyun. The perimeter is secure. What do we do with him? He gestured toward the trembling Duan. Yi Haiyan didn't answer immediately. He looked at Xiaoyun, seeing for the first time the full weight of the hidden layer she had carried from the shipping container. He had brought her home to protect her from the world, only to realize she was the only thing in the world that truly understood him. He didn't see a victim, he saw the future. He saw a mind that could calculate a war while his own hands were busy fighting it. Ask her, Yi Haiyan said, his voice a low, raspy command. The room went still. The cold rule of the Kang Empire, the isolation, the silence, the lack of trust shattered in that moment. Yi Haiyan reached out, his calloused hand finding Xiaoyun's. He didn't lead her, he braced himself against her strength. The old rules are dead, Yi Haiyan murmured, looking out over the city as the lights began to flicker back to life under her command. From today, there are 2 seats at the head of this table. Xiaoyun turned to Duan, her expression caught between the innocence she had lost and the darkness she had mastered. She didn't need to speak a sentence, her silence was a verdict. As Yi Haiyan and Xiaoyun walked toward the exit, moving in a perfect, synchronized rhythm, the underworld of Seoul held its breath. The girl no one else wanted had become the woman no one would ever dare to cross. Moral lesson: true strength is often found in the places the world has discarded. Underestimating someone based on their past or their perceived fragility is a fatal error. For those who have survived the most darkness are often the ones best equipped to command it. Healing isn't just about finding safety. It's about finding the power to ensure you never need to be saved again.